Welcome to the Seminars for the Écrits. I'm Cadell Last. This is the fourth seminar in the Seminars for the Écrits series. We've hosted Peter Rollins on pyrotheology, Todd McGowan on lack and desire, as well as Isabel Millar on patty politics. And I'm really excited today for hosting Richard Boothby, again, the final seminar of the series on the concept of doseding. Now, the point of the Seminars for the Écrits is to introduce you to some of the core concepts which are going to be more deeply developed within the course itself, in the Écrits course itself, starting this fall, September 3rd. So if you're interested in joining, there'll be sales on all Seminar for the Écrits days, and there'll be a link in the description for everyone watching on YouTube for the main course page itself. Just say very quickly, Richard Boothby is a professor of philosophy at Loyola University, Maryland in Baltimore. He is the author of Sex on the Couch, Death and Desire, Freud as Philosopher, Blown Away, as well as Embracing the Void. His areas of speciality include psychoanalysis, phenomenology, existentialism, and contemporary continental philosophy. And like I said, today he's here to talk to us about the concept of doseding. So Richard, great to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Okay. Welcome everybody else, and thanks for at least giving your permission to tolerate me for a couple of hours. I hope that I don't disappoint. I have been really fascinated by this concept in Lacan's work for some time, and my most recent book, this book on religion, sadly, I could not convince the editor at Northwestern to retain the original title, which was "Is Nothing Sacred?" ? The editor had a really strenuous objection, which I thought was silly, but she ended up winning, being in the position of authority in the situation. Neither I nor the other editors of the book could win the day on that. But I think, you know, the nothing of "is nothing sacred" was precisely a reference to doseding, the thing that is the empty thing, the thing that is the unknown thing. And it's a book that basically makes the argument that connection that human beings have to what Lacan takes from Freud as doseding, the unknown in the other, that concept I try to use to provide a more general Lacanian theory of religion. And so if you find that kind of stuff interesting, it will be a good read for you. But the thing really has fascinated me. I was looking back over my other work over the past 25 or 30 years, and it's really always kind of intrigued me. But it's also a really interesting concept for the reason that Lacan introduces it in his, as you may know, in his 7th seminar on the ethics of psychoanalysis. This is the famous French version with the bust here of Sade looking at the burning Bastille. The interesting thing about it is that Lacan devotes the first half of the 7th seminar to focusing on doseding, and focusing on it with enormous enthusiasm, signaling it as a really important breakthrough. I mean, he really sets us up to accept this as his kind of crowning conceptual move. But the amazing thing is that in the second half of the seminar, it almost completely disappears. The seminar then begins talking about the tragedy of Antigone, and Antigone as a figure of psychoanalytic interest. It's not true, as some people actually think, that it never returns in Lacan's seminars. It does. It comes back 8 or 10 times, but they're very brief mentions. So this I find extremely interesting in itself, how Lacan trumpets this new concept, but then seems to sort of let go of it. It's pretty clear what happens in that letting go. He seems to let go of doseding and increasingly put his chips on the square of the objet A, as if the objet A really is going to be his his bet for making his name and leaving his mark. And doseding, however, we don't know why. He never comments on it. He never says, why does he kind of move on, apparently, from it? In any event, I want to try and give a sketch of what I think are still really super interesting aspects of this concept. And ironically, it's a concept, if I'm reading it correctly, that really does illuminate the really key Lacanian contributions. He takes the concept, you guys may already know this, directly from Freud in the unpublished manuscript, which we now have as the Project for a Scientific Psychology from 1896. This text at one point speaks of the complex der Nebenmensch, the complex of the neighbor, the complex of the fellow human being would be a good translation. And there he's talking specifically about the earliest experience of the infant toward the first human other, the nursing mother. And there he says, we have to divide the apprehension of the infant toward the mother, which includes both a recognition, and here Freud gives already a kind of quasi-Lacanian take. He says the infant recognizes a kind of mirroring, a kind of a reciprocity of bodily form. And this becomes the basis, he says, for a kind of knowing, a kind of sense-making. However, there's also something about this other with whom the infant is confronted, the mother figure, which is, he says, non-comparable and uncognizable. It's a kind of zone of some confusion, of some kind of unknowing. Something's there, but the infant can't make any sense of it. And this he simply calls das Ding, the thing. After that, again, Freud also basically drops this concept. It seems to disappear. But we can immediately begin to make some sense of it as Lacan uses it to illuminate some of his most fundamental contributions. The first one, I think, is what could be taken fairly well as Lacan's most basic claim, that human desire is the desire of the other. That in some sense, Lacan wants to say, Freud took libido as a kind of spontaneous upsurge in the individual. And Lacan, you might say, puts this absolutely crucial detour. That desire in the human being is always somehow circuited through the other. In fact, it, in a sense, commences in the other. And I want to say that this notion that human desire is the desire of the other seems to me immediately really suggestively illuminated by the concept of das Ding. Why? Above all, precisely because it is indeterminate. It's like a zone. It's like the das Ding, the discovery that there's something in the other that I do not grasp. A dark dimension, something withheld, something that is there but is not articulate. That already suggests the openness that Lacan attributes to human desire, that there is no designated object. There's only the pure longing of desire for an object. The question is opened. What would you want? What would you choose? What would you love? So desire here, I think, related to the concept of das Ding is, you might say, if we needed it, it's restored to its dimension of pure openness, which strikes me as really important to Lacan's rereading of Freud's libido, that the human being for Lacan, it was true, I think, even in a good reading of Freud. Freud also thinks this, but that the libido is radically open, that human desire does not have a quote unquote natural object, but a kind of radical openness for assignment, you might say. So dream can deliver us into a kind of wonderland of potential desirable objects, which has no limit. The other thing that I think is immediately related to this idea of doseding as the stand-in for desire itself in all of its indeterminacy and openness, the other handy reference to a key Lacanian concept is anxiety. You guys probably all know Freud famously defines anxiety as fear without an object. Open fear, fear of you know not what. And of course, that suggests immediately, once you're onto this concept of the unknown thing, that immediately suggests that anxiety is induced. Anxiety surges in us precisely when we feel confronted with some dimension of doseding, some presence which we don't at all cognize, we don't understand, we don't know. And in fact, in the seminar on anxiety, the 10th seminar, 3 years after the introduction in the ethics, there's one really important mention of doseding. Again, it comes back, it doesn't come back much, but it comes back in this absolutely crucial sentence where Lacan says, anxiety against the Freudian idea, momentarily, he says, anxiety is not without an object. Remember, Freud says, anxiety is a fear without an object. And Lacan says, no, 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 it does have an object. That object is doseding. So of course he names an object, but it's an object which is a non-object. It's a vacuity. It's a kind of black zone. It's a zone of something unknown. So this has always struck me as fantastically useful and interesting, illuminating, that what Freud is saying is, what Lacan is saying is the fundamental emotion of anxiety is purely human, and it is purely stimulated by our fellow human being. Anxiety is the fear we have of the unknown and the unknowable in our fellow human beings. This strikes me as so fertile a concept that one can immediately imagine all kinds of sort of sociological and psychological and interrelational consequences of this. For instance, if it's true that the human being, the fellow human being, the appearance, let's say, of another person in an environment is qualitatively different from the appearance of anything else. By the way, Sartre is great on this point. Sartre doesn't have the same concept at stake, and yet he recognizes that the other human being in particular, is unique. And also Sartre links it to a special kind of upsurge of anxiety. If I'm out walking and I hear something behind me, if I assume it's a squirrel in the leaves, it's completely different than if I ask myself and begin to form the question, is it another person? That's completely different. That's a whole different game. If I'm on a walk and suddenly realize I'm in this environment in the woods someplace on the trail, and there's someone else approaching, it's a whole new game. And it strikes me also that this is not just really interesting, but seems to me borne out a lot, at least from my own experience, that we experience other people with this kind of very special electrifying recognition, a recognition of precisely an unknown. We don't know what their intentions are. What do they want from me is the question. What will they do to me is the ultimate form of the most anxiety-producing question. And then you realize also this, maybe this is why we have, this is to go to the more sort of sociological dimension here. This is why perhaps we have such elaborate everyday modes of interaction with other people, which diffuse that anxiety. So when we see each other on the street, what would otherwise be an anxious moment, we domesticate by simply saying something very repetitive. Hey, how you doing? Hi, how are you? Yo. I mean, it could be a whole number of different little phrasings, but the function, I take it, once we're alert to this role played by doseding, the unknown in the other, the role being played there is potentially anxiety producing, and we allay that anxiety with a kind of stock phrase, a kind of pre-practiced exchange. Hello, how are you? Fine. Notice how interesting these responses are. Hey, how you doing? Do we really want to know? No. If someone says, oh my God, I'm so happy you asked that. I'm having a horrible day. My checkbook bounced, my dog died, my girlfriend is cheating on me, and I've got, hemorrhoids, whatever. And you say, oh, I wasn't really asking you. That was not a real question. And suddenly I get this realization, wow, we live with doseding all the time, but we have this arsenal of petty dismissals whereby we put it on the sidelines precisely because it's anxiety producing. So we have all of these means of defusing a possible encounter with doseding. By the way, I now have the sense that the digital age, the cell phone age, the social media age, is a whole new economy of anxiety dodging, where doseding is actually still the issue, but the cell phone mediates it and allows us to have controlled exposures. And now it's a very interesting question. We don't have time to go into it right now, but it's a very interesting question. Is the new distrust and even outright hatred of the other class, the other party, the other group in the world mediated by digital resources, is that a kind of return of the anxiety-producing ding in the other? I think it probably is, and that remains to be kind of spelled out. Or here's another way in which we get this desire in the other as an open and therefore anxiety-producing question. Here's another way we deal with that. We are particularly good at watching people's eyes, where they're looking as they're scanning the room or the space we're sharing. We're extremely adept at reading the direction of people's eyes. I noticed, by the way, this is mostly male crowd we have here, but most women know this extremely well, that when a woman is approaching a man on the sidewalk, yes, there's an anxious moment. What is he up to? Do I have to be scared here? But she can also tell very exactly where his eyes are scanning her. Her feet, her dress, her breasts, her hair, her eyes, whatever it is. We have enormous kind of precision in reading eyes. Why? Because we're trying desperately to read in advance what the other's intentions are. We don't want to remain in the vulnerability to doseding. We want as quickly as possible to be able to get a read on what the other's up to, if we can. And it's amazing how much we can do that with reading the direction the eyes are trained in. It's incredible how far away we can be and still get that. By the way, here's another little interesting factoid. It is, in fact, true. We are the only mammal that has the white sclera around the pupil, which is visible from the outside. There are other animals, some of the other primates have white around the pupil, but the skin envelope that keeps the eyes in our heads, it covers up that white. In the human being, we're the only one that shows that white, which makes it, of course, easier to train, to cue ourselves into exactly where the other person is looking. Maybe I'll take one more of these sections of my notes here, and then we can switch gears. Part of what I'm saying so far is that this notion of doseding that Lacan brings forward out of that quote of Freud's, it really sets us up not only to be anxious in relationship to our fellow human beings, I've tried to illuminate that a bit, but also it kind of prepares us for a kind of general openness to something unknown around every corner. In this sense, one can say that the Lacanian treatment of doseding is a kind of theorizing the way human beings are fundamentally haunted beings. We have painful and terrifying apprehensions and anticipations just under the surface. We are highly prone to being freaked out. And the Lacanian correlative of this, of course, is the real. We are prepared even when we are comfortable. We're prepared, we're on the edge of facing something new, uncategorized, I should say. We're prepared at any moment for some weird thing to happen, which is why I take it we find horror movies so marvelous. In the horror movie, sitting in safely in the theater, we get to indulge this sense of being a haunted consciousness, at the ready for seeing something really inexplicable. The horror movie rehearses that for us in a kind of safe environment, gives us that thrill, even accentuates that sensitivity to the appearance of exactly what Lacan would call doseding. We can trace this now, this notion of this sensitivity to the unknown, that is not just a matter of curiosity, it's a matter of deep anxiety. If we really hold on to that, we suddenly realize that Lacan's take on Freud's idea, the Freudian idea that Freud himself abandons, he leaves it in the unpublished project. Had he taken it with him, he might have come up with Lacan's own definition of the Oedipal complex. That is to say, if the child discovers in the maternal caretaking other this uncanny, unsettling, ultimately destabilizing and terrifying horizon of something unknown about her and her intentions, something deeply anxiety-producing, then you could readily have come up with Lacan's own rewriting of the Oedipus. By that I mean what he calls in his early work the paternal metaphor, where the desire of the mother is replaced by the law of the father. Well, what does that really even mean? the desire of the mother replaced by the law of the father. Doesn't it mean, I'll end on this and we can go on to Cadell giving me some comments, questions, and expressions of outrage. What does that mean? What is that paternal metaphor about? I think it's marvelous to be able to import the concept of doseding as if it was there all the time, but not mentioned by Lacan. The child turns toward the father, even the threatening and punishing father of the Oedipal complex of Freud, because there is something anxiety producing in the mother, this dimension of something unknown. Language is, in the first place, the refuge. Speech and language and the community of human beings that it enables, in this theory, is the substitute for the unknown desire of the mother. The mothering figure who might, in her raw form, be thought to be capable of anything. We turn to, we could say, the law of the father. That means we turn to the regulating, reassuring structures of social life that are rule governed. Language as a system of signifiers that is sense making, that we can feel at home with because they're predictable, because they're defined. The whole game is to try to limit our exposure to the anxiety-producing, deeply unsettling confrontation with what I cannot know. Let me stop there, Cadell, and see where you want to pick things up.
Thank you so much, Richard. And I just want to say, I totally, have enjoyed going back over not only your book, but our conversation, and totally agree that, what seems to me to be your intuition that the concept of doseding is in some sense been overlooked, or not only by Lacanians, but perhaps by Lacan himself, turning to object patia, as opposed to going more deeply into this notion, is, I think, a fruitful path to follow and investigate. And I'm really looking forward to how you might bring it out further in the course. Now, there's a few different avenues that might be interesting to explore here. And I'm just trying to think of what one to start with. I mean, the first one that's on my mind is I thought it was quite remarkable the way you were talking about these simple gestures of day-to-day life of how are you doing? And I think that there's an implicit rule in our society. And I think you're also right to say that social media offers a totally different social ecology, social economy about this, but that we actually don't want to know what the other person, how the other person is doing. And I guess my question is, would society function if we didn't have this basic self-distancing in regards to, we all know when we say, how are you doing, that we just come up with oh, I'm doing good, I'm doing fine. How are you? Oh, I'm doing good, I'm doing fine. If we actually just revealed what the typhoon or the tsunami of emotions that are actually going on inside of us on a moment-to-moment basis, it seems to me like social life just wouldn't function at all. So what do you think about this? I mean, and also like the idea that if someone asks you how you're doing, especially in certain contexts, and you actually say how you're doing, like literally, and it could be very positive or very negative, some extreme of emotion, there's almost something like a social stupidity in that.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I do find this really interesting too, and that I've always been fascinated by the way in which most human intercourse of the everyday sort is banal and uninteresting and repetitive to the point of kind of hitting you in the head. It's kind of like, really? We seem to put such enormous effort into making our interactions boring. And the question is, well, why do we do that? And I think to my own sense of this is that something like this is correct, that were it not for that, the safety of that boredom, we would face a great deal more anxiety. As it is, equipped with the dreadfully repetitive, almost comically repetitive and empty gestures and sayings that we use to navigate the social world. Without that, we would be left with this kind of horrible, radical question like, well, who the hell are you, and what do you want with me? At the most trivial encounter with a fellow human being. By the way, I think that one of the reasons Lacan I'm not sure about this, and he doesn't give us any, to my knowledge, nowhere in his whole works does he explain why he seems to take a big step back from the really fanfare introduction of the concept of doseding in the seventh seminar. I mean, he really says, not only is this a great new idea, but he says, this is the thing.
He rolls out the red carpet. Now, you probably, but you might have got scared by. I mean, the concept is anxiety producing, maybe.
Well, I think he did have an anxiety, and I think the anxiety was it was too close to Heidegger. In that period, the late 50s and early 60s, he was very caught up with Heidegger, and I think that he began to be fearful that people were going to think, oh, that guy Lacan, he's just a French Heideggerian. I think that's one of the reasons why. And Heidegger, as you guys may know, had a very important essay on what he called the thing, and a whole book on the thing. His own version, his favorite example was the jug or vase, the empty thing into which anything can be poured. So the idea was actually a cousin of the Freudo-Lacanian idea of doseding as the unknown in the other, the vase that holds open a kind of nothing into which I can insert things. But the interesting thing is that that Heidegger had a very different conception of anxiety than Lacan. Heidegger's definition of anxiety is fundamentally a fear of myself. By the way, he shares this with Sartre. Sartre also thinks what's really terrifying, what's dizzyingly and vertiginous, is my own confrontation with my own absolute freedom. So Sartre famously says, vertigo, when I have that horrible feeling of anxiety standing on the edge of the cliff, it's not a fear of falling that I'm struggling with. It's my fear of jumping. I'm afraid of myself. I'm afraid that maybe I have nothing convincing to offer to stop myself from choosing to commit suicide. And here I'm a half step away from it. So I'm terrified. That is the Sartrean Lacanian existential reading of anxiety.
Well,
notice the Lacanian one is really interestingly different. What makes me anxious for Lacan is not, first of all, me, what I'm capable of. That's there in Lacan, but that's a second step, you might say. The original anxiety is actually the anxiety that I encounter in what I can't predict in the other. So it's like it's circuited through the other. Of course, once I do become afraid that the other might do something completely unpredictable and crazy, then yes, I do attribute that even to myself. I am an other to myself. Yeah. But anxiety, where Sartre and Heidegger find it in my confrontation with myself, Lacan inserts the other. And there we have where we started today. Human desire is the desire of the other. And so is human anxiety, the anxiety of the other. We are the being that is outside ourselves before we are inside ourselves, which, by the way, just one little thing, that's what Lacan meant with this wonderful little neologism, extimacy. I come to myself most intimately outside myself in extimacy.
Yeah, I love that. And actually, I'm glad you made that distinction, because what stuck out to me in reading the Écrits in regards to Lacan and Sartre was the way in which Lacan actually critiques Sartre for kind of like this autonomous ego perspective. So it's like not really taking into consideration these precise distinctions that you brought up about the role of the other, and the ecstasy inside myself. Now, I wanted to also labor a little bit about the distinction you were making about social media and doseding. That seems to me to be something that could also be quite fruitful to follow, especially for anyone here who might be developing their own ideas in the course and interested in following this path of exploring doseding a little more. I mean, it seems to me like, I just want to say, this notion I picked up from Zizek's Less Than Nothing on Hegel's maturation process is that when Hegel was young, he kind of romanticized Greek society and the polis and the harmony of community. And then in his more mature age, he came to see modern alienation as a progress as opposed to a regression. So there's this movement away from community and Hegel started to theorize this in his maturity. Now, what I want to apply that to is this idea that it seems to me like the internet and social media is in some sense eating away at our institutions. And things are moving away from the institutions and moving towards social media. And I think the reactionary position would be, let's reconsolidate the institutions, right? Like let's try and rebuild the institution somehow. But actually, it could be that social media, as they're eating away at them, is their truth in some sense. And they're falling away into social media as a different form of sociality. And this form of sociality at the same time presents enormous new challenges, socially speaking, for interaction. And so I'd be a little bit more interested in how you might think about the concept of doseding in the internet age, if you have any thoughts.
I guess I would, let me try to make this brief, but I do have a comment which cuts a little bit across the grain of what you just said, Cadell, which is that you're saying that social media has this this kind of deconstructive effect on our institutions, as though it's a kind of a solvent that softens and finally washes away the structures of our institutions. I wonder if it's actually not directly that is happening. Indirectly, perhaps it does, but I wonder if what's really crucial is that and this puts doseding back in its original site of the fellow human being. And we're going to make the most of that now. In other words, what if the first, yeah, you could call it in a way an institution, but it's not yet. It's not a symbolic institution yet. It's the institution of the hi, how are you idiocy, the kind of routine social rules that govern our interaction in the most absolutely ordinary, everyday, elemental way. I wonder if the social media is operating on that level. So it's this kind of protective regime of expectations that help us to manage the absolutely mundane, banal, day-to-day interactions with the other human beings. And what happens with social media is those everyday reactions and interactions are now on a new platform. And suddenly we're able to approach other human beings with the safety of the distance that the social media gadgetry itself provides. So we're not as conflicted and basically, attacked by anxiety. So we have this kind of fearlessness of going into the web. However, the other interesting artifact, the other interesting thing that happens with this transformation of our common interactive rules, the game of hi, how are you, and sociability and so on, when we're subjecting it to this new format, this new platform, it is as if the horrors of doseding suddenly get like phantoms. They're sort of unleashed on social media. And we're confronted by these sort of horror grimaces and horror anxieties, and which are attributable to other people. So what I find really most interesting about our current politics, and we're not the only country in the world who's suffering this, everywhere social media kind of infects human sociality, a kind of very Manichaean existential world starts opening up, where people have this divide between the good and the evil, not just friends and enemies, but really exaggerated distrust of those others who are really against me. And they are threatening everything I stand for. And all this is kind of going on in this weird artificial zone of the social media. Of course, it's also capable of spawning actual violence extremely easily, as we're now learning. People armed to the teeth with all kinds of weapons may end up showing up in, who knows where, at a protest, where the two groups appear and confront each other, and then it may turn into be an absolute shooting fest. But I guess I'm saying that institutional change is not what's bringing it. It's entirely this kind of shift in the way that I'm quite immediately relating to others, but through the social media frame, it's letting these anxieties, frequently translated into outright hatreds, run free and run riot. It almost produces them in a way that our previous social mores tended to tame them.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that obviously the creators of social media, and we talked a little bit about this last week with Isabel Millar on the new century being defined by Silicon Valley, and the creation of the world we live in today, is I mean, there's always a type of naive optimism with the origin of Silicon Valley, but I think that these dimensions that you're trying to point out with anxiety, and specifically doseding and social media, is tremendously under theorized and under thought. So just wanted to bring a little bit of attention to that. I mean, I also thought that it might be interesting to spend a little bit time talking about, and you actually brought it up a little bit as well, is approaching the other as the other sex and doseding, and the anxiety that can be produced there. I mean, I was just thinking, for example, when you were talking about there's a whole culture of pickup artistry where they're basically training guys in some sense to overcome their anxiety of approaching the other. But then very often guys who are doing pickup artistry give absolutely no thought to what it would be like to be confronted by the other, to be the woman who's confronted by this other, and what does this other want with me? What is this other going to do with me? And all of these dimensions. So, and maybe there's not so much a question there as maybe a point of reflection, but as a sort of cultural point of reference that might be interesting to think here. I happen to just be listening today to some reviews on the new Barbie movie. And one of the reviews was saying how the political point of the Barbie movie was that men and women cannot be together. Men and women have to be apart. The Barbie world is just a world of women, and the whole theme of the Barbie movie is this traversal into the real world, which is a patriarchy. and basically here just trying to think about doseding and the unknown in this context of instability and friction between the sexes.
Mm. Mm.
Just some points, maybe there's, and again, it's not a clear question, but just be interested to know what thoughts come to your mind here.
One of the things that comes to my mind is not so much Barbie, which is in the news right now, but Twitter and Elon Musk. There's a very half-baked idea. It just came to me today, as a matter of fact, was as he's launching the X replacement for Twitter, the little Tweety bird. I at least am asking myself as a possible hypothesis to explain who Elon Musk really is and what makes him tick. I wonder if he's not really getting kind of drawn in and fascinated by social media in the way that it does unleash the powers and potentialities of doseding in a new way. And he thinks this is something really exciting and maybe fruitful. He has a kind of as he himself says, a kind of radical free speech thing. I think he feels like
perhaps in a perverted way.
Well, this is exactly what I'm driving at is I wonder if he really, in a certain sense, doesn't understand from the point of view of a Lacanian psychoanalyst what actually is being unleashed. By the way, I'm not sure any of us well understand this, what social media and cell phone culture is and will continue doing to us. We are beginning to realize that it generates incredibly painful and destructive dysfunction in young people, young girls maybe in particular, although I'm not sure I think that's really something you can take to the bank. I think that may be the more obvious damage, but I wonder if it's doing damage to all of us at a rate and at a level of ourselves that we have yet to at all catch up with.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole game of, there is a culture war game of who's suffering more. Is it the girls? Is it the boys? Is it the women? Is it the men? I think we should universalize the idea of gender trouble.
Yeah.
I think but there are, I mean, depending on the statistics you look at, there are some quite disturbing statistics with young girls, of course, and there are also disturbing statistics with young men in different ways. So, I mean, I don't think it's so much we play the culture war game, but just ask ourselves about these disturbing social dynamics that are being produced through social media. I think that's sort of my intuition. Mm-hmm. There is one more major thing I wanted to bring up with you, which is the difference between, and it's just so prominent in your point of view, is the unknown, and the difference between the unknown in science and the Freudian unknown or the Lacanian unknown. Whereas the unknown in science is, it seems very inhuman, very open, like could be looking for planets, could be looking for other species, the unknown in a galaxy far, far away, very abstracted from, at least in theory, the human socio-historical context. And at the same time, when you, for example, look at the unknown in cosmology or astronomy, I mean, really, when they're looking for other planets, they're looking for another Mother Earth, or, there's always fantasies about the alien and finding the alien or the other human species. So there is always these human overtones, which seem to me to be quite psychoanalytic. But when you talk about the Freudian and specifically the Freudo-Lacanian unknown, I mean, it seems to always be massively constrained by Oedipal dynamics. It seems to be strongly constrained by birth, by the origin, by the first person who you were attached to as an infant. And then always, like you were saying, walking in the forest, and the whole game has changed if there's an other person on the path. There was actually, I was watching a Ted Kaczynski documentary, and there was one of his neighbors was talking about the level of fear and anxiety she had when she encountered Ted randomly walking in the forest one day. Not for any reason, but just, she didn't know it was Ted Kaczynski at the time, but just this, she was evoking this same imagery that you were evoking about walking on a forest path and the other human is there and there's something uncanny about that. So I was just wondering about how you think maybe the Freudo-Lacanian unknown could be thought in the context of the way scientists might think about the unknown, but then also about the unknown in the Freudo-Lacanian sense of seemingly constrained by these triadic, familial, sexual, libidinal relationships.
Let me say something risky in relation to that. I did conclude this book on religion, offering a kind of, mind you, Lacan didn't himself, not only did he not offer a general theory of religion, he advised against even trying to do it. And I then, of course, couldn't resist trying to do it, being the misbehaving boy I've always been. But in the end of this book, Embracing the Void, I do momentarily talk about a possible limited rapprochement between the religious and the scientific communities around this, around accepting the unknown, accepting our own relationship to unknowing. However, I also note there, and I kind of regret not underlining this more forcefully, I really don't think, in this sense, I guess I too have a Heideggerian hangover. Heidegger's critique of science, I still basically am very impressed by. That science, as Heidegger says, knows nothing of the nothing. That the scientific method, the whole apparatus, and I think it is very important to remember, we're talking about an apparatus, and I don't mean just a physical apparatus. We're talking about a conceptual apparatus and methodological apparatus that science, you might say, operates with. And I do suspect that scientific apparatus does fundamentally change the whole posing of the question of what is unknown and of our relationship to it. So that I think Alain Badiou is correct when he says that entering into a really genuine vulnerability to falling in love is much more terrifying than inventing an atom bomb. I mean, I just came from Oppenheimer. Maybe some of you have seen it. I saw it 2 nights ago. And it's an extraordinary movie, by the way. I highly recommend it. It's fantastically made. It's fascinating in lots of rather wonderful and horrifying ways. But and a lot of people are commenting on this now. How could Oppenheimer, with his incredible intelligence and his incredible sensitivity beyond the scientific toward questions of morality and culture and humanity and, existential questions of various sorts, how could he have so readily kind of ditched his hesitations and signed up to create a bomb before the Nazis did? Well, obviously a lot of it was a rather all too simple being authorized by being on the side, not the bad guys. The fact that the Nazis were over there kind of like made him sign away everything, every hesitation about making an atomic bomb. But I think that we need to be very aware that the unknown in the scientific mind is a different critter than it is in the unscientific mind.
Potentially an incredibly repressed.
Yeah.
Potentially incredibly repressed in regards to this question, especially in physics.
Yeah.
Especially in physics, because I think even Derrida has things about this, about nature being, or the physicist's view of nature and the woman, and the very, I mean, of course, there's a lot of pop comedy and pop shows that make jokes about, physicists or mathematicians or hard scientists, their relationship with women being strange, or just totally, totally like the real unknown for the physicist is the woman, like in the Big Bang Theory, Penny across the other side of the apartment. But I just wanted to quickly, and if you could, maybe if you wanted to comment on that, you could, but I just wanted to also highlight what you said about Alain Badiou and the vulnerability of falling in love, more dangerous than an atom bomb, with this, the cultural moment being this Barbenheimer, the Barbie, the Oppenheimer movie thing, is that is yes, okay, so the atomic bomb, very dangerous, blow up the world, but the basic message of the Barbie movie is men and women separate, and there's this type of coldness, there's this type of frigidity, there's this type of lovelessness between men and women, be like literally to the point where Barbie tells Ken, and they narrate the movie between Barbie and Ken as if Ken wanting to be with Barbie is strange, and that Ken should find out to be himself without being with Barbie. So there's this anxiety of approaching the other sex. There's this anxiety of man and woman and love and the status of love, and just being in a type of very loveless, and like the backdrop of evil capitalism as well, like the backdrop of being in a cold neoliberal world where love is impossible.
Hmm. 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 Hmm.
It's just interesting to think, and I'm glad because in the last seminar for the Ecrit with Isabel, we had a chance to bring up Oppenheimer. So I'm glad Barbie came up a little bit, but so we could maybe think about them. Any final thoughts on that before we open it up for larger questions?
I do think that one thing that would be really useful to say at this point is, we haven't said it enough, or I haven't. When we're dealing with this whole problematic of doseding and of anxiety in the psychoanalytic, especially Lacanian frame, we have to remember that anxiety, if it is triggered by the unknown in the other, if doseding is the kind of primal object of anxiety, the unknown that I discover in the other, we need to really quickly follow with the even more important conclusion we have to take with us, namely that it is my own unknown, my lack of understanding, my lack even of cognizing about myself, that is really at stake. So that anxiety in this way is restored to its original, it rejoins Freud's understanding. What makes me anxious is my own drives, my own unconscious. I am scared to death of what I'm barely keeping under wraps in my own unconscious. That's Freud's anxiety, is when those repressed impulses are rattling the cage, is when I feel anxious. And so we do need to make, in spite of the Lacanian detour through the other and doseding in the other, we need to really recall that what's at stake is what we do not understand and are terrified by in ourselves. That's ultimately at issue. The Barbie Ken thing, I mean, I haven't seen the film yet. I'm curious to see it. I'm a little terrified to see it, but I'm going to see it. But the idea of allowing, both culture and corporatized, product placement and product abuse alienates us typically so much from ourselves as to make ourselves even less able to make contact with the possibilities of our own unconscious.
I'll just say one more thing before opening it up quickly, is that there's this person on Twitter. I won't name the Twitter handle, but she calls herself the woke queen. And she says that there's only two political positions, woke and reactionary. and of course, woke in the sense of pushing transgenderism as far as possible. Just makes me think, in the context of what you're talking about with this detour through the other and back to the self, is, what's at stake in a political movement that frames itself as woke and reactionary, where there's no love, so there's no detour through the other to confront one's own unknown, and then that leads you to basically enter a culture in which many very complex decisions about sex and gender transformations are being made. Are they how to interpret this in a Lacanian sense? Are people bypassing, avoiding the anxiety with the other sex, and just undergoing these transformations in oneself to become the other sex as a type of I don't know, is it the truth of the unconscious, or is it a betrayal of the unconscious? Maybe, I don't know, if you don't want to answer that, we'll get to other questions, but
yeah,
makes me
maybe
think about that.
yeah, maybe we have so many promising hands. Maybe we should go to them.
Okay, so Nick, you were first to the punch. Welcome, Nick. Glad you could make it.
Thanks for inviting me. What a marvelous lecture, very thought-provoking. And one of the thoughts that came to me when we were talking about social media and the omnipotence of doseding online in all of its most horrific forms, it seems like, well, what that results in is a kind of proliferation of these social codes. I think you said these sort of petty dismissals that exist in everyday life, and maybe they're more simple when we're out on the street and we run into someone and say, hey, how you doing, just to sort of put them at ease. Whereas online, there's so much potential for the terror of dusting to break through that I think it sort of also increases the necessity of having an entire array of these sort of social protocols. And one of the results of that, to me, seems to be this phenomenon of like cringe, which I take as almost like a kind of subspecies of anxiety. But I think it's like when we're online and we're, let's say, mostly texting, we become so much more aware of what we say to the other. And then it's like re-registered in a way that it's, it's cringy, because we become maybe more aware of like the falsity of these social protocols, but also just the fact that they're not enough. I don't know, do you have anything to say about cringe as a phenomenon or a subspecies of anxiety in this sense, and how it's related to dusting?
I think your formula you just articulated of cringe as a kind of species of anxiety is precisely correct. Of course, there's lots of, I suppose you could say there's lots of, as we say these days, cringe-worthy experiences and cringe-worthy stimuli. But I do think that it reminds us, and I think this is one of the key values of this Lacanian idea of dusting, that, by the way, I'm not settled about why exactly Lacan so predominantly left the idea behind. I do think the best I can conjure is that it was an attempt to reassure his epigones that no, I'm not a Heideggerian. And I think there was good reason to distance himself from Heidegger. Lacan is not a Heideggerian. However, I think that his distancing himself from the idea, I think it actually came at a price of a certain diminishment of what Lacan himself had to say. And one of the things that it diminishes is an appreciation, a properly psychoanalytic appreciation of the way in which our usual modes of social interaction, our whole script of what Heidegger called, Gerede, the usual everyday interaction of and the way that we conduct it, the idle chatter that we negotiate with others in and through. I think we're not well equipped to understand the impact of the new media, to the extent that we don't understand that the stakes are confrontation with something like this anxiety-producing vortex that is potentially in the sort of eyes of everyone we meet. And even those eyes are still there, even if we're not face to face. But social media and digital technologies do create a kind of zone of distance, which causes our usual protections and our usual ways of kind of girding ourselves against too much of an exposure. Either we're exposed, or more than, maybe even worse, the other is exposed too much. We're kind of adrift. And it's all, of course, the fact that it's happened so fast, that it's a single generation, and we're in another world. I don't think that we are appreciating how volatile that is. And this Lacanian theory is, I think, got to be a huge resource to understand what's happening to us.
Did you want to follow up, Nick?
No, that pretty much covered it. Thank you, Dr. Boothby.
Thanks for the question. Brilliant question.
Big Sig?
Fascinating conversation, Richard. I really appreciated it. It was very enlightening. I guess my question kind of has to tie into, like, going back to the middle of the discussion where you highlighted not only the relationship of doseding and the anxiety-provoking thing in the other or mother, but the relationship with this and the paternal metaphor and Oedipus complex. And my sort of speculation or question is, like, is the relationship between the paternal metaphor and Oedipus complex sort of necessary? And what I'm saying by necessary is, like, in the process of repression, supposed to keep at bay this anxiety-provoking theme in the mother or other. Because if we go back to, like, the sort of mythic moment that Lacan talks about, in which the child realizes that the mother has a desire that is something that I can't, as the child, give or satisfy. But the question of what the mother desires is still unknown, but that the paternal metaphor, the law, keeps that at bay. Because I think in Seminar 10, he talks about the crocodile mother, in which the mother's sort of desire is overwhelming and anxiety-provoking. And it's like the father kind of jams that in, like, the phallus jams in the throat to protect the child from being swallowed.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting quote, because when he compares the mother to the jaws, the gaping jaws of the crocodile, and we're suddenly given to understand this absolutely counterintuitive, terrifying prospect that actually the mother is a giant carnivorous dinosaur that's about to bite your head off. He then says the only thing that prevents that head from being bitten off is the phallus propped into the mouth of the crocodile at the right split moment. Well, let's reflect about that for a second. Other than being a wonderful image, kind of a joke, what's Lacan trying to say? I think what he's trying to say is absolutely the core of his whole, the joke aside for a second, the whole core of his thought is, this is what the paternal metaphor is about. Language steps in, our reliance on the symbolic system and its operation steps in and stops that violent possible outcome of having our head bitten off by the maternal, the mother on the loose, as it were. What's going on there? When the law with a capital L of the symbolic is imposed, when the name of the father becomes installed, have we just simply cut ourselves off from all of this possible disruption and trauma to which anxiety is the response? And the answer for Lacan is no. And this, I think, is the most, we haven't dealt with this at all as of yet, but this is the absolutely crucial thing, which maybe will help us a little more with this social media problem. What Lacan wants to celebrate in the paternal metaphor, and I think he carries this with some big amendments. He carries it all the way through the late seminars on Joyce and all the rest of it. Language is the miracle that both protects us, like the stick in the jaws of the crocodile. It protects us by instituting a kind of formalism, a kind of distancing from the raw encounter with the unknown. But it always returns. Why? Because every time I enter language, I can always be confronted with the question, whether it's something someone else has said to me, or even something I myself say to others. I can always be confronted with the question, yes, I heard what you said, but what did you really mean by that? What do you want from me? And the genius of Lacan is to, I think, to have noted, he's not alone, but he notes it and links it up with the whole psychoanalytic architecture, conceptual architecture. He says language both stabilizes us, gives us a kind of trellis to protect us from an unmitigated onslaught of something like dusting, but it also always offers us a way of touching on this terrifying and otherwise perhaps deadly thing. And this takes the form of everything we say has more potential meaning than what I get out of it in the moment. This is Lacan's fundamental kind of wager, in a way, that language has a kind of infinite richness, so that it always has this poetic dimension. You always say, as he was like to put it, we always say more than we intended, or that there's always something more to be gotten, like there's gold in them hills. There's always the potential for something that's really reanimating and restorative and reconnecting us to the very things we're afraid of in language. So it's not only a matter of the rule of the phallus, the rule of the father that kind of puts everything in a box and stabilizes. It also gives us infinite opportunities, if we're open to it, to reopen our own unconscious in and through the symbolic exchange.
You want to follow up, Big Sig?
Yeah, just one short thing I'll add on, just because I know other people have questions. With that being said about the phallus, then, as the sort of protection and also admission into the symbolic order, is there then this relationship between the encounter of anxiety within the mother with the maternal phallus, especially when it seems like with perversion and childhood perversion, there's this emphasis of always trying to encounter that void within the mother and sort of get enjoyment from that act. Does that make sense?
I guess what I would want to say to that is, and maybe this doubles back a little bit to the discussion we were just having about our contemporary moment with the digitizing of our symbolic milieu, that we're in a different relationship to language in the digital age. And I guess I would say that one of the things I think Lacan is this is the tension in Lacan's thought, as I think of it anyway, between, people often, and he often kind of talked about this, how he liked being ambiguous between a revolutionary figure and a reactionary figure, that he was not entirely on board with the 68, revolutionary atmosphere. He in fact kind of taunted the students to say, you want a new master, well, you're going to get one. He was very savvy about ways in which our symbolic the architecture of our symbolic life world is intrinsically a mixed bag. Some of it reactionary and some of it the opening to something revolutionary. And you can't have one without the other. And one of the problems now is things are being destabilized so quickly. And now we haven't said anything about AI. We've been kind of stuck with cell phone culture and social media, but AI may wash in yet another tidal wave of transformation of the symbolic universe that we live and breathe in, and the Lacanian dynamics that he struggled so valiantly to try to articulate. Maybe, who knows, how thrown into a mess by our whole relationship to AI and a computer-driven existence. So anyway, this is all by way of saying, really, I think the questions you're asking are really important, and it doesn't seem to me that there are very many. We will be lucky if we can catch up with thinking about this fast enough to make an intelligent response.
Sounds like a blast. Matthew?
Hi, thanks for being here, Dr. Boothby. I appreciate it. I really like your book about metapsychology and Lacan. That was pretty influential for me. So I had a question kind of based on, actually, I had a question, and then based on what you just said a little bit, I had another question that kind of came up. So, but they're related. So I'm wondering, when you're talking about using the law as a way to protect us from the devouring mother, I'm wondering where you would place both the scenario of the devouring mother, but also the experience of kind of before the self emerges, that kind of void, that like womb-like experience. I'm wondering, if phallus is the law, is the devouring mother the imaginary and the womb-like the real, or like where is it falling into that taxonomy? Because I'm wondering, because it's almost like you could go law, father, imaginary, mother, but at the same time, that the devouring mother figure almost seems more like the real that you're trying to protect yourself from. So I want to ask more about the emergence of dusting in the mother-child relationship, but would you comment on that first?
Yeah, my immediate reaction to the way you just framed it is to say that, you're right to be total sympathy about being confused. It's hard to parse this stuff when you really get in the trenches of trying to think it through in real human experience. But yes, I think you're right in what you were just going for, that when we talk about the doseding, the thingly dimension, this kind of terrifying abyssal character of something unknown in the mother, you're talking about the real. And the imaginary is a stabilization which comes at a price. So I think the way Lacan thinks of the formation of the ego, and investing psychically in refortifying that structure of the imaginary ego, is our first line of defense. And we also have to remind ourselves that there's nothing intrinsically sexed about this. There's a whole other question which we can maybe touch upon about the formulae for sexuation, and that Lacan lays out in the later work, where the masculine and feminine, and that sort of fetishistic on the one hand, and the non-all, the pas tout of the feminine posture or feminine subjectivity on the other. Ultimately, we need to be careful translating Lacan's own translation of the Oedipus, keeping the roles gender specific. What Lacan's talking about, I think, need not necessarily be given to us by a woman. This confrontation with the Nebenmensch, as Freud called it, the neighbor, the indeterminate other, who I first, you might say, in this sort of fable of the origins of these dynamics, I encountered that in the other which I do not understand. By the way, it's overwhelmingly likely that the primary way in which I encounter this otherness, this unknowable otherness in the other human being, has to do with vocalization. It has to do with what these strange sounds that the mother's making. Or we could say the caretaker, whether it's male or female, is making. That I'm bathed in these strange sounds, which is both in some ways reassuring and in some ways anxiety producing. The more that I realize this other means something by these things, but I don't know what it is. So anyway, I maybe I'm kind of bollocksing up my response here, but I think that basically you're exactly right, that the three famous categories can be mapped onto this discussion we've been having very easily. Is that I feel like I lost the thread a bit. I don't know if you want to.
No, it was helpful. I mean, to identify the devouring mother with the real, I think that then it makes more sense that the like womb-like experience is the imaginary. It's that desire to return to some sort of, union, some sort of fantastical union, that probably belongs more in the realm of the imaginary, I would think.
It's kind of interesting to me, and I don't know what to make of this. This is a very sort of shooting from the hip kind of comment I'm going to make, but I'm wondering whether our recent social, sexual, psychological history, at least in our contemporary American culture, where suddenly there is both a blossoming of sexual, gender, and general personal identity formations, a kind of revolutionary kind of opening, where you almost can't find the end of the LGBTQ to and so on series of letters, where it's turning into an unending sentence of letters. There's something fascinating about this, as though sexuality and sexual identity is itself kind of like dissolving and forming brief new crystallizations, only to then kind of reform. While on the other hand, the other side is becoming the sort of Ron DeSantis, psychosis is, actually psychosis isn't the word for it, but the Ron DeSantis reaction is desperately trying to put the genie back in the bottle. I wonder if part of what we're learning is exactly how these identifications, sexual identifications, gender identifications, our whole sense of ourselves is much more plastic and malleable and volatile, much more variable than anybody has heretofore really realized.
Yeah, I definitely, I like that. I like the plasticity of desire and the vicissitudes of instinct that comes with Freud. I don't know if I don't know where you stand, Dr. Boothby, but politically I'm not as optimistic about the proliferation of identities in our society. I don't see it as terribly revolutionary, but that's my personal take, and others are totally willing to disagree. I kind of had I had another question, but I know other people are asking questions, so I'll just.
I think we have enough time. I think we'll be able to get to everything. So if you want to ask another quick question, go for it.
Yeah, I wanted to learn a little bit more about that emergence of the dusting in the encounter with the mother. I'm one, because from what I could tell, from what you said, it was kind of like, I couldn't understand the initial move. You talked about the mirroring, and then you talked about, but there's something that escaped that. I wanted to understand what is the initial movement of the child and their encounter with the other, and then, yeah, I think I need to understand that initial movement so I can understand what that, like what the process is that is, there's something escaping that process. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. It is true when Freud, he writes a very brief 2-page note about this in the project about the Nebenmensch, who he says splits into what I know from a kind of mirror relation. He's quite amazingly anticipating Lacan here in this sort of imaginary character of this side of it that I recognize in a kind of body-to-body symmetry, something that I can sort of recognize. I can kind of orient myself with this other who has a hand over here and a hand over here and a head in the middle. And then he says there's something more and non-comparable, he says, in this encounter with the other. Well, he doesn't specify what that is, this non-comparable excess. But I think Lacan does not too much express this either, but it's pretty clear that for Lacan, it's language. It's the stream of sounds that the other is continually making. And I'm beginning to realize slowly, whatever these sounds are, they're directed at me. Now, how exactly is that arrived at, that conclusion that I'm being spoken to, even though I don't know what's being said? But how exactly that occurs, we would have to work out. Kind of a whole kind of new linguistics or a branch thereof has to figure that out. But I think Lacan's point is this excess, which we're calling doseding, is largely communicated by language, which, by the way, when we think about it now, it's perfect for Lacan's whole theory, because he wants to say language is always excessive. We never know fully and stably and exhaustively what is being said. There's always a kind of surplus. Whether we are the infant who doesn't yet know really vocabulary at all yet, or you and I having this conversation, or you and your lover tonight having a conversation, we never know totally what the other has just said to us. That excess is ultimately what we're talking about with doseding. And that excess is what is both thrilling, it's what makes life worth living, but it also makes us, at the wrong moments, anxious and deeply uncomfortable. So we're defended at the same time we're trying to cozy up to this excess. There's something in it that attracts us and something that is terrifying.
All right, Objet Lillet.
Sorry, go ahead.
Dimitri?
Yes, Richard, how are you doing?
Don't
answer that, you're not supposed to. I mean more than I say though, but that's up to you
we all do, that's okay.
No, it was fantastic. Very interesting. I am interested in the concept of objet petit a, and maybe it was a bit naive. You can break the spell here, because I always thought about it in the following way. I thought like doseding is kind of like a pre-linguistic real version of object A, which then gets mediated by the signifier, and then you get this like basically this deification of this semblance object A. Now, yeah, how do you think? Maybe that's completely wrong, by the way. But what do you think about the relationship between doseding and object A? How should we understand that?
Yeah, well, I don't to tell you the truth, I don't know how idiosyncratic my own take on this is. I had an exchange with Slavoj Žižek about this last year, that just came out in a book called Žižek Responds, in which various Lacan scholars kind of wrote a kind of, in effect, a kind of question for him to say, look, Slavoj, you know, thanks a lot. We've learned a lot from you, but I'm confused about this or that. And mine was about doseding and objet A. And Slavoj had posed the two, objet A and doseding, as objet A is, he said, ontological, and doseding is ontic. Now, Buddy, I don't know, just to make sure we're on the same page, ontological.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the language. Yeah.
Okay, good. So, and I sort of basically argued back and said, actually, I think it's the opposite. I think that the objet A is the ontic moment. That is to say, when the basic stakes, the ultimate stakes of doseding, that is to say, a horizon of something that just kind of overwhelms us, we don't know, and we feel a thrill, maybe pleasant. We can have a thrill, like the thrill of the roller coaster. You know, we have a thrill of anxiety. At the same time, it may also have this painful part. But that's our exposure to the question of being. And the moment of objet A, which, yes, typically is a detail, very typically, maybe this is a bit stereotypical, but very typical of objet A, and I think you were kind of pointing a little in this direction, that objet A kind of instantiates in a particular kind of time space, you know, crisscross, a kind of specificity, some odd standout detail that is massively overloaded with meaning. So we sort of say, oh, wow, you know, you're sort of captivated by it. You're perhaps even kind of assaulted by it, but in a way that you immediately see, this is really important. I don't know what it is, but it's really important. I'm struck by it. I wanted to say this is an ontic moment without belittling it by saying that, but just to say it's very specific and it's right here, announcing its enigma. Now, that little sketch, keep going if you would. Is that online with what you were asking about, or beside the point?
Sorry, what?
I'm just wanting to know if that, I was trying to try to say how I myself read the relation between the two of them.
I have one more follow-up question on this that will maybe clarify it a bit more, because yes, you can oppose the register of the imaginary to the register of the symbolic or the real. Now, in Less Than Nothing, Žižek actually talks about that it's a move that people do, and it's a mistake that they would oppose, like the real of the real, the real of the actual degenerative mortal body to the pure image of, like, let's say, the beauty of the, you know, the beauty that really catches your eyes. And he says, no, it's not like this. It's actually that the real is in that very image. So how would you situate the real as inside of the image related to objet A or doseding? Because the image can be like tremendously anxiety provoking as well, right? The beauty of the image. So what? Yeah.
There's a really interesting ambiguity in Lacan's own introduction of these things between the 7th seminar and the 8th, where the 7th seminar introduces doseding as this unknown, and there he seems to really emphasize its indeterminacy. And then this is when he then gives the definition of sublimation, where he says sublimation occurs when the object is elevated to the dignity of doseding. So the ordinary object, let's say an apple, when it is painted in the right way by Cézanne, it becomes something inexplicably more than an apple. It still is an apple, and yet it's a haunted apple. It's a kind of, it's a sort of wraith, a ghost, a kind of ultra reality of an apple or something. I don't know what, but you get the point. There's a kind of like an additional mystery that is imbued in and through the object of art, you know, in sublimation. Interestingly, the following year in the seminar on transference, he says, he amends his view. He says, no, doseding is precisely sublimation is precisely the kind of beautiful epiphany that protects us from dusting, so that he already introduces this kind of strange mix of interpretations, as if he himself is waffling about where exactly to put the function of this confrontation with the zone of the unknown and the nothing, as opposed to its instantiation in some sense, its thingness, it's a reassuring kind of definiteness. Already in his way of kind of talking about sublimation, he's already kind of moving from one position to another one that's not really very compatible with it, which I thought was interesting, because he himself, I think, is struggling. What is the right vocabulary and what's the right conceptual kind of scheme to give us this stuff? I wonder if he didn't finally settle on objet art because he kind of avoids all these kind of all too Heideggerian messes and questions, to just stick with the little split moment, the split second of an epiphany of something significant for we know not why, that's so typical of objet art, a kind of instantiation of the exception and of the exceptional. So it has the power of dusting, but the specificity of an object.
Do you want to respond, Dimitri?
Well, I would just have more questions, like how this relates to the Kantian sublime, like Hegel's view on the thing in itself, but it's too much for today. Thank you for answering them anyway.
Just as a tiny bit addition, I think that all those kinds of, I think this is Lacan entering precisely that philosophical space, and I'm not sure he himself ever feels fully satisfied. I think he's nervous all the time, and I think objet art was selected by him as his best he could do. You know, at the end of his life, he basically says, my one greatest contribution to psychoanalytic theory was the concept of objet art. Partly because it isn't even a concept, he says, you know, it's something else. It's kind of like this elusive, intrinsically elusive something.
All right, Javier.
Right. Hi, Dr. Boothby. I really enjoyed your speech and what you're talking about with doseding. Something that kind of came to my mind was, and perhaps you maybe answered this in the book, but I want to know how you think about rituals in relation to doseding. Mainly because there seems to me, you know, I'm wondering if there's a difference between a sort of the social repetitions that we do, like hi, how are you, versus the sort of ritual repetitions which I understand that ritual repetition can sort of be socially coded, but I feel like there's an element of ritualization, especially if we're talking about like the mystics, where they seem to have, you could say, a encounter with doseding in some ways. So I'm curious about, how do we think through repetition that sort of distances us versus repetition that wants to bring us closer to doseding? Because it does seem like, in my opinion, ritualization seems to be the apparatus that can, I guess, safely help you encounter, potentially through repetition, to encounter the doseding. But I'm just curious how you think through that. Yeah.
Well, that's a great question. I'm thinking of a book that I recently read, The Death of Ritual, which you maybe, I think I'm remembering the title correctly. It's this what's the author's name? Korean, now in Germany.
Byung-Hil Chon.
Yes,
Byung-Hil
exactly.
Chon.
Yes, thanks. I think this is a really, really germane and really fascinating and really difficult question. And it gets to the subtleties of what we're talking about. What are the conditions for the opening for the subject of something like this horizon of the unknown? But the unknown, and this goes back to the question, Cadell, you were asking about science and religion, or science and psychoanalysis. I think there's really subtle horizons here about what enables us to be open to something that really feels simultaneously beyond us, and yet again in some impossible way internal to us. This typical experience, I say typical, but it's kind of something familiar from the mystics. Augustine says, I know the presence of God in me better than I know myself. Like this is my core self. This is not some thing from sort of outer space. This is from inner space. This is from my heart. This dwells in me. And I don't understand how the hell it got in there. That sort of thing. These questions, I think, are really, really fascinating. And I feel like I'm as much an amateur about them as anybody. I would, just to follow up to 2 seconds about that, and you should follow up too if you'd like to ask another kind of point on this. But I feel like the Lacan, in his maturity, is more and more sensitive to exactly these subtle problems. So when he goes from symptom to symptôme in the late seminars, I feel like this is something that's very much in his mind when he's reading Joyce and talking about Joyce's way of using language in ways that make language speak freshly and somehow transcendentally. He's also struggling with this very question, I think, the one that you're asking.
You can follow up if you want, Javier. We have enough time.
Well, I mean, I just want to say thank you for answering anyways. I mean, for me, I'm excited because now it's definitely a question of rich exploration to kind of think through all together on this one. So, but thank you for answering.
I mean, it's kind of like it is, I think, and Lacan also gives some hints in this direction that Asian traditions often have a richness around these problematics that is matched perhaps only by the Western mystics, where the capacity for the greatest openness in the most radical sense of the term open can be possible only through a cultivation of something like ritual, something like tradition, something like an aesthetic that can seem very constrained and repetitive. But I think my sense is Lacan becomes more, as he matures toward the end of his career, he's more sensitive to this. Not, unfortunately, that he has all that much more to say about it, but I think he's sensitive to it. And I think personally, it's a very, very important question.
All right, Chetan?
Thank you for a wonderful talk. It was lovely. I just wanted to sort of go back to, I think Dimitri sort of hinted that problem. I was talking to a person who was doing he was sort of reading Kant, and he saw doseding to be much more closer to Kant than to Hegel in that sense, and he saw that as the moment where Kant sort of emerged in Lacanian writing, because doseding actually mirrors much more the thing of Kant and I'm not very well read in this literature in that sense, but the Hegel's thing in itself actually has a much more maybe closer affiliation to say object-lil and Kant's the thing actually is much more closer to in that sense doseding, because it perpetually remains outside. It can never be had. It can never be brought back in. It can never be. How do we look at this kind of a problematic between Kant and Hegel in the way doseding is coming in, and maybe is that the reason why sort of Lacan stepped back from it, because it became too maybe Kantian, if not Heideggerian, or is there something more to that that Kantian moment is within that?
Yeah, that's a good point. A good question. I think that Lacan is aware that the Kantian reference is going to inevitably come up in people's minds, and my sense is that he, without enormous emphasis, but he gently tries to say, this is not the Kantian Ding, the Ding an sich, the thing, which is very tempting, of course, because it seems like the Lacanian category of the real is also very much like das Ding an sich in Kant. I think what arrests it, what makes it not such a good Kantian problem, is that for Kant, the problem is my cognition of something outside myself, where for Lacan, the question of das Ding is something intimate to my very being. Ultimately, I am das Ding. I discover das Ding in the other, the fellow human being, but what makes it so electrifying is I am myself this Ding, which means I am beyond definition. I am not one. So I think this, by the way, already includes the patu of Seminars 20. The patu is the non-all, the intrinsic excess. This is already essential part of what Lacan means by das Ding. And I think for the most part, you could maybe make it, intersect with Kant, but not on the, I would say, not on the usual understanding of the Ding an sich, that is the unity that I suppose behind its phenomenal manifestations.
Thank you so much. Can I just have one more question, Kedal? If it's,
Go for it. Yeah, absolutely.
In that case, Doctor, one of the things that I was thinking about is that with dusting, there is something very particular about dusting to the subject, but dusting also has great sort of consequences for collective formations. Language allows dusting to actually become not only of an individual, but it also becomes something which is shared in a community. Maybe it is through its sharing the community gets formed. And I think there's a lot of discussion in today's time, at least in India, we're sort of trying to think through this problem of at where do we place theology within the within the larger matrix of this question of institutions, rules, science, scientific thinking. But there is something of a theological element, I think, which sort of always emerges, because there has to be an object which we all have to share together, which perpetually remains outside the realm or domains, or which cannot completely be brought within the linguistic rule formation. Would that be right way to think about this kind of a way to play with dusting in that sense?
This reminds me a bit, I don't know if it's in your intention, but it reminds me a little bit of Javier's question about ritual, that what we're talking about is not at all far from being incompatible with the specificity of cultural and ritual repetitions and recognitions. It can actually depend upon them. So we're in a zone of paradoxical relations. And I do think, by the way, precisely then, to go back to your mention earlier of a Kantian versus a Hegelian perspective, I think this is another instance in which Lacan, despite ways in which he often resists Hegelianism and basically says, I'm not a Hegelian. I'm not sure I believe that. I think I have a much more, I think Todd McGowan and I share this view that despite Lacan's own hesitations, his own tendency to critique dialectic as a kind of making everything neat and tidy, tying all the ends together in the dialectical fulfillment, I want to say no. No, there's a real non-closure in Hegel's dialectic. And the non-closure is actually the point. But the non-closure does allow us to include something like the repetition of ritual, the recognition of social norms, the stabilization of the law of language is not incompatible with poetry. That sort of thing.
Thank you so much. Thank you. This is wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah, it has been wonderful. So there, I mean, we can talk for a bit more. I mean, there are times for at least one or two more questions if anyone does have questions. But it seems to me, I'm just creating the course now, and I was reflecting specifically because it's fresh in my mind on a paper where he's talking about Henry, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but it's E.Y.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know the paper I'm talking? It's basically about a theory of organism and dynamism. And Lacan is, as usual in that paper, quite overwhelming in how well read he is. He's just like the most well-read person ever, and he's always showing you how well read he is in very clever ways. But he talks about Descartes a lot. He talks about Hegel a lot. He talks about Marx, Freud, Plato. And at the end of the paper, he actually says that because all of these thinkers were oriented towards a true idea, that these thinkers cannot be overcome or surpassed, and that it's just a fashion to try to overcome these thinkers. And that he's basically talking much more about a working with these thinkers. So I don't know what you think, but at least in my initial readings of, or initial rereadings of the Écrits, it seems to me like Lacan's approach to historical philosophers is often quite loving and respectful. Know what you think of that?
Well, I would say more ambivalent. Or in the end, I don't know. I mean, this is something we can chew over now, maybe if we have a few minutes, because
Yeah, for sure.
I
No,
think it's
we
a
got
really
time. We've got
open question. I'm more impressed, particularly because my own training is in philosophy, so I'm sensitive. I want to say, wow, when Lacan seems to really dismiss philosophy, a kind of echo of Freud's dismissal of it. It seems to me like Lacan wants to say, I learned a lot from reading the philosophers, but in the end, I'm not about philosophy. And the philosophical demand for a kind of solution, an account, is exactly what I'm kind of resisting.
Let me read the quote then just directly, and I'd love to have your opinion on it. So it's from page 157, and here's the quote. He said, "You have heard me lovingly refer to Descartes and Hegel in order to situate the place of the imago in our research. It is rather fashionable these days to go beyond the classical philosophers. I could just as easily have started with the admirable dialogue in the Parmenides. For neither Socrates, nor Descartes, nor Marx, nor Freud can be gone beyond, insofar as they carried out their research with the passion to unveil that which has an object of truth." End quote. With that, I mean, of course, we could pull out other quotes where he doesn't say such loving things, but
Yeah, although it also challenges us to know, what does he mean by the use of objective in that last phrase? Is that complementary, or is that actually pointing out the ultimate limit of the philosophical project? I mean, I think it's not hard to find places where he's appreciative of various philosophers, for sure. Deeply appreciative. I mean, I think he would regard anybody who doesn't know the philosophical tradition to be, in a certain sense, not in the game.
yes.
But nevertheless, I feel like he and I find, by the way, it's precisely around this problem of doseding that you can mobilize a deep rationale for this resistance to the philosophical, which, by the way, takes me back a little bit to the question we were talking about Kant and doseding. That strikes me that he wants a definition of doseding that is much more radical than the Kantian one. The Kantian one, you might say, almost pre-limits
Absolutely
the meaning and impact of the idea, where Lacan, I think, really wants to say there's something genuinely and radically abyssal in what we're talking about here.
Absolutely. I mean, even reflecting when you were talking about rituals and doseding, that, I mean, my reading of Kant's life is that his rituals were designed to avoid doseding.
Yes, right.
There's even some funny stories about his rituals being disturbed, and he would actually come down with physiological illnesses because the defenses of the rituals were were protecting him from some excess.
Yeah.
No,
He
but
says,
of course there's
not unfairly, he says Kant was a great obsessive compulsive and Hegel a great hysteric.
right. Yeah, I mean, certainly phenomenology of spirit and science of logic are hysterical explosions in some sense. But yeah,
only for the good reader.
yeah, I think there is obviously I pulled out that quote because it was just fresh on my mind. I had just read that paper, and in the context of that paper, I do think I'm fair in saying that he is referring to them lovingly, because he was critiquing his friend, again, this Henry A guy at EY. I don't know how to pronounce that last name, but he was critiquing him for being very simplistic, like with the common critique of Descartes is like, oh, he's a dualist, mind-body dualism. And he's critiquing this simplistic critique, or the simplistic negation of the classical philosophers. I think what he's trying to encourage there is deep reading of the classical philosophers. And so that when you do, or if you do critique or try to go beyond it, it is in some sense an earned critique. It's not just simply regurgitating some simplistic negation, which requires more depth and more thinking. I mean, I often think it's very easy to throw around or negate dead guys, especially when especially dead guys who happen to be the foundation of paradigms. Like, I'm always skeptical when I hear people just very simplistically critique like Newton or Descartes or Plato. It's like, seems kind of a little bit coming from a place of arrogance, but just because anyway, that but there does seem to be there is that big question of Lacan as anti-philosopher, and maybe that would be a good final question or a good final reflection for the seminars for the Écrits, is since basically in both my enacting of Philosophy Portal and sort of my interest in, let's say, the Slovenian school and various thinkers in our larger cultural ecology, which are engaging psychoanalysis, but from a philosophical perspective, where do you see this relationship between philosophy and Lacan as a anti-philosopher? And even yourself as someone who's, in your book actually inspired me a lot, is Freud as philosopher. Where you seem also to be making this move of what is philosophy after psychoanalysis, which I think is even the question today.
Well, one thing I think to me seems really clear that and you were just putting it, I thought, quite eloquently, that Lacan deeply appreciates the legacy, the openings that philosophical minds have enabled over the centuries, that we owe a huge kind of debt to that tradition, even as we need to be restless with the sense of final conclusions. We deeply are deeply indebted. It seems to me he's deeply respectful of that.
Absolutely. He actually ends that paper. He ends that paper by with a great line that says, "The truth is always new." But just this idea that, of course, just because you've read these classical philosophers, it does not mean that you've closed on the truth. The truth is always new. Okay, so I'm just gonna give a little spiel here about the Écrits course, and then we can have maybe a final thought before we all go. But this has been the seminars for the Écrits. For everyone who's been coming throughout the month, thank you so much. The seminars for the Écrits was a kind of spur of the moment idea, I also think that this has also served the course really well, because you've been exposed now to, in detail, the thought of Peter Rollins, Todd McGowan, Isabel Millar, and now Richard Boothby. And these are just tastes, these are just windows into their perspectives, of course, and they're going to be developing these ideas much deeper in the course itself. The course starts September 3rd. And if you just go down, you see all the information about the course, some of the questions that often come up in regards to Lacan, what you get in the course. There will be 13 lectures by myself, as well as exegetical reading spaces, discussion spaces co-mediated with the Vanishing Mediators, and of course, 4 guest lectures from the 4 guests we had during the seminars for the Écrits. Dimitri Croimans will be leading the exegetical reading spaces. I think Dimitri and I are going to have a conversation about what specific parts of the Écrits would be best to do exegetical readings on, because we want to highlight those, say, gold nuggets, I think Todd McGowan called them, in the Écrits, and specifically design spaces where we can really spend some extra time on those specific spaces. And as well, like I mentioned, the Vanishing Mediators will be sharing discussion space with me and everyone else, which I think will diversify, the question and answer matrix which I think will be really helpful, especially when we talk about Lacan and psychoanalysis. And there's 3 different tiers, including one-on-one, as well as tier 2, where you also get the What is Sex course, which was a course I did with Theory Underground and Dave McCarricker. So all the information is there. I guess, Richard, do you have a final thought, even a final tip or trick that you would offer students going into the Écrits?
Wow. I guess I would say the same thing about reading the Écrits that I would say about reading Hegel, to at least what I tell my students. When you come to a sentence that trips you up and stuns you and leaves you, numb and dumb, keep reading.
All right.
Don't stop. That's would be my best and perhaps only advice. Yeah.
All right. Great advice. And again, thanks everyone for being here. Thanks, Richard. And with that, I'll close up. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you all. Yeah.